And welcome back, guys and girls, to another episode of Talking Tabletop. Now, today we are going to be diving into none other than the stat blocks for our different characters and units, and this is really a video geared at beginners to gain an understanding of what these stats are actually looking at. So, stat blocks, what do they actually mean? So we're going to use Strike Force Octavius for the purpose of this video again, and we are going to focus in on the main man himself, Captain Octavius, mighty Space Marine Commander. And if you're new to Warhammer 40,000, stick around because we will walk through each and every stat on this sheet to make sure you understand what it means on the battlefield. So let's gear up and let's get started. So, when we start looking at our stat block, obviously there are a lot of numbers here to think about. So the first up is going to be our movement. Okay, highlighted here on the screen, and movement comes under the letter M. Now this corresponds to how far that character can move. So in this case, Captain Octavius clocks in with a movement of 5 inches. This tells us that he can move 5 inches each turn. That's pretty standard for Space Marines. They're quite chunky, quite bulky, and you'll tend to find that they're mobile enough to get into action, but not so fast to outrun support or attackers. Now, when you look at other units, when you look at other characters, and depending on the role within the battlefield, movement can range up and beyond 12 inches in some cases, and can be lower than 5 in others. So, if you were dealing with Captain Octavius in particular, keep him moving with his squad and you will be in good shape. Now, movement, fairly straightforward again, just how far they can move on the battlefield. We then move on to the T characteristic. Now T stands for Toughness. Now again, looking at Captain Octavius here, he's sitting at a toughness of 5. So this really determines how hard it is to wound him. The higher the number, the tougher the model. With toughness of 5, he's pretty resilient to most small arms fire, but can still feel the heat from heavy weapons. So when your toughness is low, positioning is really going to matter with those units, whereas if toughness is high, you're talking front line, getting into the fray, a bit of a tanky unit. So Octavius, somewhere in the middle. We then go on to talk about our SV. Now SV stands for our saves. So starting with the regular save here, we can see that Captain Octavius has a save of 2+. This means that whenever Captain Octavius takes a hit, or whenever he takes a hit, sorry, you'll roll a dice, and on a 2 or better, he will shrug that off. So pretty amazing, yeah? If you think about it, you know, you've got what 1 in 6 chance of not actually saving him from a wound roll, which is pretty good, right? Now, however, there is more to it. If we then consider anything beyond that. Now some weapons have armour piercing or armour penetration. We then move on to think about this invulnerable save. So what this actually means is it kicks in when the attacks are so powerful that they ignore regular armour. So if the AP comes in, and it will affect those saving throws, what can happen is you would then go to your invulnerable save. So if, for example, a weapon had AP -3, that would mean Captain Octavius or any normal character would then have to go from a 2+ to a 5+ to save. What Captain Octavius and other characters with invulnerable save can do, they can opt to use their invulnerable value, so in this case 4+, and it means they're always going to be rolling with a 50-50 chance of taking the hit and gaining a wound, which is really useful and can save you in quite a lot of scraps when you're standing in the thick of battle. And this then, because I've mentioned it already, leads us on to W, or our wounds. Now Octavius here has 6 wounds applicable to himself. Now what we've got to think about here is, this is effectively us saying the health points or the hit points of the model or the unit that we are looking at. So every time that character or unit takes damage and fails a save, you're going to lose a wound. You lose one of your hit points, one of your wound points. With 6 wounds, Captain Octavius can take quite the beating before going down, but other smaller units that aren't specialised characters, they can have 1 wound, 2 wounds, it can be very low. So if you've got, say, a horde type army and you're going to be facing off with lots of lightly armoured, squishy targets, they're not going to take much in terms of toughness or necessarily in terms of wounds, whereas those more resilient units are going to have a higher wound count, probably a better armour save as well, because they are your elites. They are highly trained warriors that are there to protect or to fight in battle, so therefore they are going to be able to do a little bit more. Now we then move on to look at LD. Now LD stands for leadership. Now In Octavius's case, it's a 6+. Now, leadership really comes into play when things start to go south. So, if your squad starts to suffer losses, Captain Octavius, being a leader, isn't likely to panic. But keep that number in mind when you're then looking at morale checks, battle shock checks, things like that. That is where that value is going to become important when you're in your command phase within the battle. And then finally, we move on to OC, or Objective Control. Now, Objective Control is the ability of a unit to hold an objective and contest that objective against other units. Now, Objective Control, again, you can see here, Captain Octavius has a value of 1. So even though he's a powerhouse, he's not actually that strong at controlling objectives as some dedicated troops. So in essence, you don't really want Captain Octavius camping out, you want him moving around the battlefield, clearing objectives for other units to then move in and hold them, okay? So he's really your kind of front line, getting into the fight, getting into the mix. OC, those with a higher value, they are kind of designed to then camp and hold those positions, and they will be hard to remove from those positions as well in most cases. Okay, so in terms of our kind of basic stat block, that covers everything about the character. Then we move on to now kind of talk about the different stats that come in when we talk about our weapons. Okay, so easy one here, we have our range number. Now on ranged weapons, obviously that will be a value in inches to tell you how far on the board that weapon can effectively fire. When you're at half of that range, things like rapid fire come into effect, and you can then start to add to your hit rolls and things like that, but those are specific rules that we'll cover in other videos. When you look at your melee range, then you are literally in melee combat. You'll have charged your enemy, or they'll have charged you. You're in contact base to base in order to then use that weapon. We then look at the A. Now A stands here for attacks. Now if you count these out, a ranged weapon, or Stormbolter for example, Stormbolter, it's a ranged weapon, 24-inch range, it's got 2 attacks. Now in terms of 2 attacks, you're hitting twice. It's okay, it's a good number, it's not great, but it's quite effective when you're able to fire it a couple of times before an enemy unit gets to you. Now then we look at our melee attacks here. Now obviously Captain Octavius, he's a bit of a tank, he can hit 6 times when he uses his melee weapon. So you can see here why it would probably be in your best interest to get him into melee range in order for him to maximise the damage on enemy units. He is a brawler, he's designed for that. Now, this takes us on to, and again, just to put it in context, that means that every time you attack with Captain Octavius using a melee attack, you're rolling 6 dice to hit. Okay, with a ranged weapon, with Stormbolter, you're fighting 2 to hit. However, if the enemy was within 12 inches, you actually roll 4 times, right? It gives them 2 more attacks. That's what Rapid Fire 2 means when you are within half of that effective range. Now, in order to then make those attacks hit, we then look at our Ballistic Skill, BS, when we're looking at our ranged weapons, and our Weapon Skill when we're looking at our melee weapons. Now, on this occasion, we can see Captain Octavius is 2+ on both of those, so that means he's really effective at hitting targets, okay? He's not got the heaviest firepower, his melee is better in terms of the attack, however, you can see here that, you know, he's going to be a bit of a force to be reckoned with. Your odds of rolling 2s or more, you know, a 5 and 6 chance on each of those types of weapon. So quite high opportunity here to really do some damage using this particular model. And again, all models will have a different ballistic skill and weapon skill depending on, you know, their status and things like that in terms of the lore and where they fit in with your actual gameplay. Okay, we then move on, and S stands for strength. Now when we talk about strength, strength goes hand in hand with toughness, right? If you're attacking, your strength value will go against your toughness value of your opponent, and that will dictate what you need to roll in order to create wounds. Okay, so initially you roll using your ballistic skill or your weapon skill for gaining, you know, whether or not you hit, and then when you look at your wound rolls, you're then going to be rolling your strength stat against the toughness of your opponent. If it is equal, you roll a certain value, you roll a 4. If it is less than or more than or greater than double or less than double, you're going to have to kind of go into working out what you're meant to roll. And again, we'll cover that in a separate video, probably a short, because it's actually relatively straightforward, and I've got a really nice chart I made for that one as well. So, and you can see here the Stormbolt has a strength 4, relic weapon has a strength 5. So again, they're going to hit middle of the road targets pretty well. High value targets they're going to struggle against, low value targets they'll do well against. This then moves us on to the second last in terms of our stats, and that's our AP. Now AP, as I've already said, is your kind of ideal of armour penetration, and in the case of the Stormbolter, it has no AP, so therefore it doesn't affect those saving throws, right? It won't necessarily make the saving throw alter for the target. The melee weapon though has an AP of -2, so what that means is whatever the saving throw is in order to save from gaining a wound, it's then going to increase that, in this case, by 2. If that was -1, it would increase the saving throw by 1 from whatever that ends up being. Okay, which is actually really, really good. Or sorry, the wound roll. The wound rolls. It's going to affect the wound rolls. Now, when we then move on to our final one here, we are going to be looking at the damage inflicted. So a ranged bolter weapon, or stormbolter weapon, it's going to do damage in terms of each hit will inflict 1 damage, or 1 wound. When we look at the melee weapon though, each hit, or each successful hit, each successful wound will actually apply 2 wounds per successful hit. Okay, so although we are talking about 6 attacks, so say all 6 go through, we have the potential here to actually inflict 12 wounds on an opponent, which is really, really strong compared to 2 possible wounds from the Stormbolter. So that hopefully summarises all of the stat block, and then it wraps up a kind of breakdown of Captain Octavius in particular, but hopefully you've gained some insights into how to then deploy units effectively based on their stats. Remember, when we were looking at Octavius, I know I've used him as our poster boy or example, he's a solid all-rounder. He's tough, he's mobile, he's packing a punch in both shooting and melee, but keep him supported and he'll do wonders for your combat patrol if you're using him in that format. Any unit though, when you're looking at their stats, consider what you're using them for and then pick the best unit for the job from the army that you've got available to you. So again, that's all for this video from Talking Tabletop. Thanks for tuning in. Join me next time as we break down maybe more units, more strategies. We'll do maybe another deep dive into combat patrol, probably looking at Necrons next. But until then, keep your bolters loaded, your dice rolling hot, and that is us signing off. Don't forget to like and subscribe.